Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Emily Harris, and I work for Vermont Emergency Management. Vermont Emergency Management. I'm pleased today to be joined by Kate McCarthy Barnett, who will be speaking with us about equity and inclusion in emergency management. Thank you so much, Kate. Take it away.
Great. Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Kate McCarthy Barnett. I work as the Disability Integration Advisor for FEMA Region 1 out of Boston. I'm thrilled to be here this afternoon. It's been a great day so far. I've enjoyed all the presentations. I'd like to say welcome to those of you who are potentially in the room and all of you those are online today. So today, as Emily mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit about equity and inclusion in emergency management. We've had a lot of opportunities, as many of you know, over the last several years to increase our focus on equity, increase our focus on inclusion as we responded to many different events. I mean, most recently, obviously, in terms of Vermont, we've also looked at COVID-19 and we'll touch upon that. But really in thinking about equity, what I'd love to have you do is for those of you who are in teams, if you could jump to the chat, we're going to keep this a little interactive this afternoon. I know it's been a busy day. If you can jump to the chat and just write one word that comes to mind when you think about the word equity. Equity, what comes to mind? If you can just drop it into the chat, we'll see who does it. Those of you who are in the room, not quite sure what the layout is, but if you're sitting next to someone and want to share one word, that would be great. So while I watch for the words that come to mind when it comes to equity, I would just like to talk a little bit about our game plan today. We're going to talk a little bit about challenging assumptions. We're going to look at the situational awareness and common operating procedure. A little bit about access, equity, and inclusion, some key principles of accessibility, and then we'll wrap up. I just wanted to let you know I did have a co-presenter who I was hoping to join us today, Peter Rennert, but he actually was deployed to Puerto Rico. So if he jumps in, he's kind of the subject matter expert to some of the common operating procedures. So we'll look at that. All right, in terms of the words that we've had, looks like Sarah posted access. Excellent word, equity and access. Kelly said resources for all. Wow, what a great option. Resources for all, we'll talk a little bit about that. We look at equality, we look at equity. What's the difference when we're looking at those terms? Charlotte, compliance, excellent. And Emily, great, equal access and collaboration. All right, if you didn't have a chance to jot anything down, there'll be future opportunities and greatly appreciate anything. These are excellent. Equal access, resources to all. Oh, Brittany, removal of barriers. We're going to talk about that. What are some of the key barriers that we've seen over time? So yeah, great start in terms of where we're at. Now, if those of you in the room had a chance to do it, maybe you have an opportunity to share among yourselves, but hopefully they're around the same format. This cartoon I put up because I think it provides a great foundation when we look at equity and inclusion. For those of you, you have a child sitting in front of some steps going up to the school, and he's saying to the person who's shoveling, could you please shovel the ramp for me? And the gentleman who's shoveling says, all these other kids are waiting to use the stairs. When I get through shoveling them off, then I'll clear the ramp for you. And then, for those of you who can see, the child says, but if you shovel the ramp, we can all get in. That's the basis and the foundation of really what we're going to be talking about today. How do we bake it in? How do we ensure that everything that we're doing has that foundation of equity and inclusion? So let's see. The key spot. What I like to think about here, and I'd appreciate you starting to think about equity and some of the comments that have already been provided. For years, we have had sort of the philosophy of the emergency management mindset, right? What do? We follow our command staff, we go in, we do our response, we do our recovery operations, we do all that. I've had the honor to be deployed to many disasters as a disability integration advisor and spent quite a bit of time in Vermont, actually. I would say a little over a year when we responded to Irene. I think that might have been back in 2012. And then most recently assisting with some PA disasters that we have up there. And then, of course, working in terms of COVID. So, Vermont, without a doubt, is one of my favorite places to be. So I love going up there. But this emergency management mindset, again, has really focused on, the ICS structure. What do we know? How do we respond to disasters? What's been interesting is that although it's been many, many years in the works in terms of disability and equity, we're finding more and more that this has become a terminology and things that we want to include. Plans are going through and there's being questions, are we ensuring that we're meeting the requirements, the disability requirements? How are we addressing equity? What does equity mean? What's the difference between equity and equality? And how do we do this? And so I think when you're looking at this paradigm shift over the years, where we're at and where we've been, one of the key components is what I have listed below, which is the question is, are we planning with instead of for? Are we planning with? Meaning, around the table, do we have those individuals that we are planning for? Have we included the communities? Are we looking at different populations? Are we asking the question, is this inclusive? What are we missing? Because when we start to do that, and Vermont, kudos to Vermont, phenomenal job across the board over the years that I've seen in terms of doing this, but it's a great lesson for others to learn as well if you haven't had the opportunity. Before you can plan, there's a great saying in disability that says nothing about us without us. And basically what that means is, well, if you're planning for a population, let's have them around the table and let's talk through, is this working? Will this work? Won't this work? And that's what we like to say when we like to see a paradigm shift. In doing that, yes, Charlotte, great point. I'm sorry, I'm just noticing that. To centering and elevating the voices of those who live with the experience. Absolutely. I think that's a great point. And that's exactly what we're saying. I mean, I've been in emergency management many years in terms of disability integration in FEMA. It was after Katrina that they decided within emergency management to have this position in each of the 10 regions. For those of you who don't know, FEMA has 10 regions, and region 1 is from Connecticut to Maine, all the New England states. And they basically said, okay, in Katrina, as you may recall, tremendous hit on populations that needed additional assistance, either before, during, or after a disaster. And so they established this Office of Disability Integration and Coordination at headquarters, and they identified individuals to have this role in each of the 10 regions. I've been lucky. I was hired back in 2011 with FEMA Region 1 when this was a new position, and I continue to be here. Every day is something new and interesting, and we continue to learn. So it was interesting before coming to FEMA how people were not necessarily at the table. So Charlotte, thank you for that point. And please, anyone add points as you go through this discussion today. So getting to the point of challenging assumptions. Here's what we're talking about. We have looked at for years sort of perceptions versus reality, right? What are our perceptions? What's the actual reality of the situation? And how do we find that out? Well, I think really it's an exciting time in emergency preparedness because over the years, as I said, we've seen this shift. We've seen a shift from what would be considered kind of like what's called the medical model. And when we're looking at the medical model, what we're looking at is how we design our emergency preparedness programs, response and recovery. And typically it was based on, let's say, the limitations or the additional needs that the person might need. So very basic. In looking at the medical model for years, what had happened is if we had a hurricane, let's say, and we set up a shelter, and an individual who uses a wheelchair came to the shelter, and the shelter, let's say, didn't have a ramp, right? Well, it would be viewed on as, oh, that person can't come into the shelter because that person uses a wheelchair, all right? Well, what's wrong with that? I think we're all kind of thinking it. What really happens is what's called the social model. And the social model is where we're at in emergency management right now. The social model would take that same exact situation. You'd have the person who uses a wheelchair coming up to the shelter. Let's say there were stairs and they couldn't get in. It's no longer viewed as though the person can't get in. It's now viewed from a perspective of the barriers. What are some of the environmental barriers? What are the social barriers? What have we done in emergency management that is causing that individual to not be able to go in? It's taking the responsibility off the person as though there is an issue or a challenge within the person, and it's putting on us as emergency managers to say, hey, listen, we need to think about how do we ensure inclusion? How do we ensure equity? And that's what moves us to the social model. Here's a little graphic when you're looking at the social model. Kind of explains what I'm talking about. You have the person, let's say, well, who has a disability. And then the disability is currently viewed as, a variety of different stereotypes and that type of thing. When in all reality, it's the environment. It is what we are doing in the environment that's impacting individuals not being able to access our services and what we're offering. And it's this shift that we're at in emergency management. I think that's one of the best when we're talking about it. Now, here, I love cartoons, so here's another cartoon. And if Peter Renner jumps in, just let me know. Basically, in looking at this, what do you have? You have a woman who's saying, so what's the matter with you, dear? And again, patting someone on the head who uses a wheelchair. And this gentleman is saying, apart from your attitude and these barriers, you mean question mark. Well, what do they mean? I'd like to take a moment now. And again, as we move forward, if you have an opportunity to just drop something in the chat and just kind of say what barrier you have seen in your work in emergency management, whether it's response or recovery, what type of barrier have you come across or have you seen or have you planned for individuals with disabilities, others who may have access and functional needs, or any other kind of equity in terms of things. So while those are being jotted down, I appreciate you jumping in and jotting those down. Emily's great. Emily's written down language. Excellent. Oh, Charlotte, again, language. Boy, that is such a good point. Language is critical. Anybody else have any thoughts to share? Oh, low vision. Really good. Low vision, no vision. Cultural responsiveness, cultural differences. Yes, excellent points. We have seen all of this. People who are deaf, and wow, yes, we're sharing some of the same things. But yes, people who are deaf, cultural differences, people who might have be blind or low vision, needing medical resources again, and emotional support. Perfect. So we are right on target. These are all the things that we have seen. Laura, cognitive disabilities. Excellent point. We often overlook in our planning the needs of someone who might have a cognitive or intellectual disability. Perfect. And Kelly, buildings without ramps, as they have not been updated. What an interesting thought. They have not been updated. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. Oh, and Emily says, full disclosure, I'm in the physical room. Oh, Emily, that's great. So maybe you're picking up the answers from people there. I'm thrilled. Thank you. Charlotte, again, lack of mental health supports, memory issues, brain trauma, and recognizing the trauma. Geriatric, wow, absolutely. You can get a sense already of those individuals who are participating today and the things that you have seen. Oh, substance abuse issues. Yeah, that's another one. And we see so much more of that. So the question becomes, how do we start to address these? I mean, when we're looking at the barriers, all those that were mentioned, we're also thinking about, let's say, a lack or impacts of losing your durable medical equipment, right? Other assistive devices, transportation, we'll talk about, looking at emergency notifications and all of that. And I think support services, not to mention provisions for service animals. Again, these are all things that we've seen over the years. Have there been shifts? Absolutely. Nick, racial indifference. What a great point. What a great point, Nick. And boy, did we see that during COVID-19. We saw the impacts of equity tremendously when we looked at our COVID-19 response and recovery. So that's a really good point. So in talking about this, socioeconomic barriers. Excellent. So let's see what's going on next here. Excellent points. So the situational awareness and common operating procedure. We've talked about all of these now. We've heard a wide range, everything from the access from people who have specific types of disabilities to durable medical equipment, to having cognitive disabilities, substance abuse, racial indifference, language, socioeconomic. All right, this is a tremendous amount when we're looking at it from emergency management perspective. So we can go back and say, okay, wow, I'm overwhelmed. When I started in emergency management many years ago, I used to go to these meetings and there would be a separate annex for individuals who had communication needs, a separate annex for people who had different language needs, a separate annex, let's say, for someone who had an access and functional need or circumstances of access and functional needs. In the end, what happened? You had 10 different annexes on all different populations. So it got to the point where we said, all right, how can we do this better? And that's where the equity and inclusion comes in everything we do. We don't need separate annexes. We need to make sure that what we're doing across all of our common operating procedures and policies and plans is ensuring the needs of all individuals are met. So if it's a communication strategy, are we addressing the needs of all communications? You know, if it's an access strategy, like we're talking about with buildings, are we looking at it in the perspective of individuals with a wide range of physical needs can access it? So in doing this, and my colleague, Peter Rennert, like I said, who is deployed right now to Puerto Rico, this is kind of his specialty in terms of the areas of looking at. So I'll touch upon it briefly. I won't do it as great as he would, but what he wanted to mention was the fact that regardless of what the population is, keeping in mind it's individuals who might need additional assistance before, during, and after a disaster. Quick show of hands. I know we can't really show hands, but if we were all together, maybe just, raise your hand yourself. Do you happen to know anyone in your life that might need additional assistance before, during, or after a disaster? Someone who has a physical disability, someone who has a chronic health condition, someone who might need a different language, anything along those lines. I'm seeing a lot of hands being raised, and I'm assuming many people are thinking that. And I think what we find when we ask that question is the fact that every one of us knows someone who might need some additional assistance, who might need some accommodations, right? So if we all know someone, I often say when you go to the table, you think about that individual. It might even be yourself at this point. I mean, and it could range from someone who uses a wheelchair full time to someone who might temporarily be on crutches to someone who might have had a heart attack and isn't moving as fast during evacuation. So it truly touches every one of us. It could be a family member, it could be ourselves, it could be a colleague, it could be a friend. And so when we're looking at these requirements and we're looking at the considerations, the assumptions, and the impact of a disaster, the question becomes, how do we ensure that we're truly meeting the needs of all these populations? And does it take some time and some energy? It does. But in the end, what winds up happening is that you have a plan that is inclusive for everyone. And I think for those of you who did put a little raise your hand or put a little thumbs up, I'd love for you to think for a moment, the next time that you're sitting down and writing a plan or assisting or thinking about your response and recovery, geez, how does this impact it? We'll talk in a few minutes about building access and physical access. Well, people often think when we're doing our planning, physical access, what's the first thing we might think of? First thing we might think of is someone who uses a wheelchair, right? I mean, it's just a common thought. Well, what you might not realize is also for people who women or men who have a baby carriage, bringing a baby carriage in, elderly who might use walkers or just need assistance. It's such a wide range of people. And that's what we're talking about when we're looking at inclusion and equity. How do we go across the board just to make sure it works for everybody? Okay, so when we are looking at our requirements, and we're thinking about so many different disasters, and we can think back even to Irene in Vermont, even to the most recent disaster going on with the public assistance there, to even looking at COVID. The primarily focus areas that at FEMA that we tend to look at when we're looking at equity and inclusion fall into these categories. The first one being, evacuation and transportation. And throughout any of these, feel free to jot down, or do a thumbs up if you've seen these in your experiences. I like to do this sort of as a group activity, but this hybrid isn't quite going to work with that. So we're just going to roll with it and come up with some ideas. Evacuation and transportation. I am sure many of you who are here and joining us today, that has been a critical issue. It's been an issue for years in terms of Do we have enough transportation? Are we able to evacuate individuals? And what happens when we evacuate individuals? Where are they going? Yes, we have shelters. Years ago, in Vermont, when we had Irene, I remember there was an evacuation going on and people were being evacuated from their homes. And at the time, this was, many, many years ago, at the time, people were being evacuated, and the logical thing at the time was to take people from their homes, and they wound up in nursing homes or in hospitals. Well, immediately, Vermont Emergency Management Agency, along with FEMA, said, no, we can't do that. We need to ensure that people who are independent before a disaster remain independent, right? So Vermont was very forward thinking. Vermont Emergency Management, they immediately stood up a task force, and I remember being part of it, and they identified the individuals. When you think about it, evacuation, it's an immediate response. You're going in, you're wanting people, you're wanting to move them, you're just thinking about safety and security at that time, right? Well, here they had a task force set up, and they went through every individual who was identified, who was either placed in a nursing home or placed in, let's say, a rehab facility, somewhere that was not an opportunity to maintain their independence. And one by one, Vermont successfully found the individual, found family members, found alternatives, and brought the person back to the community, even potentially to a shelter that was accessible. And that always stood out in my mind as such a great example that I've shared before across the country on other presentations on how proactive Vermont was at the time to recognize the importance of maintaining independence. So that doesn't always happen. Many times people wind up in facilities where that would not have been their first choice. Alerts and notification, huge one. Alerts and notification, the populations this might impact the most might be people who are deaf, hard of hearing. The alerts and notifications may not be in multiple languages. Many of these things have we seen over the years. Now, in all of this, we've had tremendous strides in terms of moving things forward. But every once in a while, we stumble across a barrier in a response, in a recovery mission where this continues to be an issue. I know for some things that I've done in terms of like nuclear power plant exercises, one of the strategies that was being used, I think I was out in Arizona at the time, was they went around the neighborhood and they honked the horn. And the honking of the horn was the notification for individuals to say, okay, time to evacuate. Well, okay, what's the impact of that? Not everyone can hear the horn, right? So it became an issue immediately in their after action, which kind of said, well, what other alternatives do you have in terms of your alerts and notifications? So we see this a lot. Again, I'm always impressed with what Vermont does. Vermont is, leading efforts in many of these areas. So this is just kind of a reminder as we go through things. Effective communications, how many things do we have in multiple languages? How are we looking at effective communications? And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Power and equipment. Wow, I sat in on the presentation earlier today. I apologize, I don't recall the gentleman who gave the presentation. I think he was a planner from Vermont, but he talked about, the power and the power strategy and the plans, and was looking for feedback. And I was thrilled to hear him mention, some of the populations that might need additional assistance. So again, it's being very proactive. And oftentimes we look at power and we say, okay, well, how are we addressing power? And I believe there was another presentation that I heard either today, I forget, but they use the HHS and power data. If those of you who haven't used it, it's the data that identifies individuals who I believe they might be on Medicaid. I can send that, but it includes individuals who are currently on equipment in their homes, which then become a priority for, let's say, first responders to know about it. But power is always a huge issue. Shelters and housing, temporary housing, shelters obviously are doing great. Oh, Emily, thank you. Rich, the planning section chief for Vermont. I gave him a thumbs up today. He was awesome in terms of addressing that. And then finally, supports and services. A few of you mentioned, individuals who might need additional supports, substance abuse, cognitive disabilities, and other areas, people who are older, people who have dementia, Alzheimer's. We see those additional supports being needed. One of the interesting things that came out of COVID-19, when we looked at COVID-19, was sort of like, how are we addressing it? I want to say it was Connecticut at the time. All the hospitals, as you know, had the policies where you could not have visitors. Very, very hard time on so many people and so many families. But Connecticut put forth some concerns that were raised to equal rights and civil rights, talking about the fact that individuals who needed those additional supports should have the opportunity to have family members join them. And that went straight through and also, led to changes in terms of how they were going about their services. So again, just different ways of looking at it. So we talk about our laws. I'm not one to go into great detail in terms of our laws because I feel like we know we are required by law to do certain things, right? Here's the list of things that laws apply to: notifications, evacuation and transportation, all the things we're talking about: sheltering, lodging, long-term recovery, other disaster-related programs, services, and activities. What I like to say is we know that we have the law behind us to do things, but oftentimes in emergency management, everybody is here really because we end up doing the right thing. It becomes the right thing to do. When you think back to the population and the individuals that you raised your hands about and thought about when you came to it, you didn't immediately think about, oh, that person is legally required for this. You thought about it because that's someone in your life. It's someone that you know. And that's where I love to see our shift in emergency management, where we're no longer pulling out the book. Yes, we need to know about the ADA. Yes, we need to know about the Rehab Act. All of these things impact directly why we do it. But now we're to the point where we do it because it's the right thing to do. And now we go back and we look at the laws, and you work with FEMA and others to talk about, well, how do we now implement this so we're meeting the needs of the whole community? So as we think about that, I'd love for you to jump back in again. And Emily, if you're in the room, we talked about the first word that came to mind when you think about inclusion. Now I'd love to see you type in or share with Emily the first word that comes to mind when you think of the word equity. Equity and inclusion, what comes to mind? Might be very similar, but let's see if there's any differences. And by the way, Charlotte shared a great point about being proactive and having trust with the community and building those relationships is critical. Having them at the table when making the power and the decision making. Yeah, Charlotte, I think we're going to talk about this. One thing that comes out of this, it's opportunities to meet with the community. And if you do not have those lists, and Vermont is tremendous with their advocates, that's something that we can work on as well. So, all right, going back to some of the words, we have fair. Oh, power sharing. I like that. We have inclusion and no bias. Brittany mentioned equal access. Yeah, Nick, great thoughts again. Fairness. And Laura, representation. These are great examples. And Kelly, I think you said it great. Equality for all. So, you say, why are we talking about this? Haven't we always, lived by these values? Isn't this something that we've always done? I can remember when I first started in emergency management, and we had just written the Functional Needs Support Services Guidance for Shelters. I don't know how many of you were around back then. It was many, many years ago. And I can remember going out and doing training, and I would get pushback saying, well, that's going to cost a lot of money. That's going to be so expensive. And I sat there thinking, but wait, this became law like 20 years ago. Why is it such a new thing? Sometimes it is for exactly some of the words that you said, the equal access, the no bias, and going back to what Charlotte said about having everyone at the table. When people are at the table and we're doing our planning, we are now planning with everyone. And sometimes things that we think might cost a lot of money, the solutions are out there. But how do we go about coming up with those solutions? And I think that's where having individuals around the table is going to be key. So let's think about this now from equity, access, and inclusion. For COVID-19, Many of you may know that, equity was a key component, and there was a lot going on in terms of equity and how we were ensuring that, every community received the vaccine testing and all of that. And we use the social vulnerability index. I'm sure many of you use that, but basically with the social vulnerability index, when we're looking at equity, focuses on, as someone said earlier, the socioeconomic status. The household composition and disability was a key component. Somebody mentioned earlier the language, also looking at minority status and looking at housing and transportation. So when the vaccine centers were opening up, the states looked at each of these. Were they on a transportation line? Did you have the formats and the announcements in multiple languages? Were accommodations provided? All of these areas were really focused on. And you go back and you said, I've been doing a lot of research on this recently for some of the work that I'm doing. And it's kind of like, well, haven't we always done this, was a question that I was reading about. And it came back and it said, well, yes, but it was brought to the forefront even more, again, because we started to have data that was showing the populations that were underserved. And that goes to the importance of, understanding the data, using things like the social vulnerability index. Recently in Connecticut had its first, I think it was Region 1 actually, our first IA, Individual Assistance Declaration, and I want to say maybe 9 years. The last one was with Sandy. It was a small deck, it wasn't huge, but it was enough for us to go in and really look at those equity components. And what we wound up doing is, as the state had different declared areas, right? We went in and we said, okay, let's do an overlay. Let's do an overlay from the SVI of that particular area, and let's see what pops out. Well, fascinatingly enough, what popped out were certain areas. There was a component of individuals who lived in an apartment and it was close to a school for children who were deaf. There was another area. So what we wound up doing is we had teams, the disaster assistance teams, I think they were called at the time, who went out to those particular areas, were able to knock on the doors and find people who hadn't yet registered for assistance. So, that's one example. The community vaccine locations all throughout Vermont, I know for a fact that you use the SVI data for your locations. You use that data for the identification of the languages, all of those things. So this has become something that we're using a bit more, and I'm thinking possibly you are as well. And so in looking at this, I just put this particular graphic up because I'm always thinking equality versus equity. So if you look at on the first graphic, you have 3 individuals on a box. And in this image, what's happening? It's assumed that everyone will benefit from the same supports. If everybody has the same box under them, they'll all see the baseball game behind them, right? They're all being treated equally. Well, in the next image, individuals are given different supports. So the one person doesn't have any, one has 2. And what we're saying here is, okay, we're giving something, therefore everybody would be treated equitably. Well, what happens in the third one? Well, in the third one, the barrier was removed, right? There's nothing there blocking anyone. So that's what we're talking about when we're looking at the barrier removals. The systemic barriers are being removed. And this is what's happening a lot in emergency management right now. So the key principles of accessibility we'll talk about. And please, if you have any questions, either raise your hand or post them, or if you're in the room and can share it with Emily, share away. This is just a quick recap. In looking at, you have sort of the equity component, we have the inclusion component, and the access piece. We've seen this for years. The first one, physical accessibility. We saw several notes come up about this. Physical accessibility obviously is from the moment you either get off the bus, the transportation spot, to the entrance into a building, to the parking, right through everything that we do. Is it physically accessible? Does it meet the needs of everybody? Very simple at times, but sometimes some strategies would help. I know in the past that Vermont has used site assessment teams. I know that you've done training to conduct site facilities, and we can always help with that as well. The DOJ has a great assessment checklist, And one of the things that many states have done in the past, and we're starting to see more of a movement and trend of this, is to actually identify those buildings during a time when we're not in the middle of response or recovery operations and know where those locations are. Lots of times it could be a school, but then schools are in play. So how do we go about doing it? So this is something that I know Vermont does. If you don't have an opportunity to do, FEMA can also jump in and help you with that as well. Effective communication. We talked about this before. The key components, and this is especially for all meetings that you're having for the public. Any meetings, I like to say, that are public facing. Yes, your internal meetings, that's different because that could be an employee and that would be a specific accommodation that they may have. But anything that you have related to resources, services, programs, plan that's external facing, need to make sure that you have these available, whether it's video remote interpreting, the use of CART, sign language interpreters, and closed and open captioning. These are all very important to have with effective communications. So in doing this, some of the tools that we may use is the list of the qualified interpreters, plans for the alternate formats, the different types of assistive devices, and really looking at some of the low and the high tech options in terms of what might be available for you. Here's some examples and some pictures of different things. And again, the emergency communication for all and the picture aids have become more popular. We saw this a lot, especially during COVID in terms of things. And the last being programmatic access. Programmatic access is basically, what are we doing to ensure all of our programs and policies are accessible to everyone? So I have a quick question for you before I show you the examples. I'm putting up a picture right now of a gentleman who's trying to get on a cot and there's a worker sitting there in a shelter. I'd love to hear how you might address this in terms of eliminating the barrier. How might you address programmatic access to make this particular situation more accessible? While you're looking at that and typing in an answer or sharing it with Emily, I'm going to jump back here. So type it in. How would you make this situation, address it from a programmatic access standpoint? So while you do that, some ideas for programmatic access, which aren't related to that particular picture, are putting the notice of an accommodation in, right? Planning so that everything is baked in from the very beginning, like there's no questions in terms of things. Ongoing staff training, and my favorite, which I post everywhere, is this just ask. Just make it easy for staff to do the right thing. This just ask poster, I believe Vermont has them. If you don't, we can provide them. But it just says, if you need any of the following, just ask. All right, so let's see what kind of solutions we came up with here. Let's see, new messages. How can I be of support to you? Ask the individual. Excellent. Anything else you can think of? How about purchasing maybe accessible cots in advance? If we had an accessible cot there, right, that would be a programmatic solution. But the ability to just ask the question, I think, is going to be one of the key components. And I know we're closing in on time, so I'll just, keep moving here. But, I myself use a wheelchair, and I'm always, when kids come up to me in the store and they, try and ask questions, one of the things that I found is sometimes parents will tell the child, don't ask. And I look at it as no, ask the questions, because I think that if we were all like children were and ask the questions, of course, there's a different approach, as we get older in terms of how we might ask it. It's that fear that builds up the attitudes that leads to sort of the generalization in terms of how we might view things, where if you just ask a question like, can I open the door for you? How can I help? What's the worst thing that can happen? Somebody says, no, I'm good, but at least we're asking. So yeah, again, Sean Coleman, excellent point. So to wrap it up today, is really when we're bridging the gap and looking at equity and inclusion, here's the things that we kind of talk about. Having the strategies, resources, and solutions for survivors, knowing what those are. Identifying those community members, we've talked about that. Pulling them around the table, having them there with you. What's that pertinent data? We've seen the impact that the data on equity has had during COVID-19. Are we gathering that same data? Are we using it, let's say, for people with disabilities? What are some of the other ways that we might use our data? That deliberate planning is critical, and understanding and acknowledging the requirements. We have those requirements out there. How do we meet those requirements? How are we meeting those requirements? And again, a collaborative effort. We can't do this. We can't all do this independently. We all came here, let's say today, to talk a little bit about equity and inclusion, right? We all have different thoughts and considerations and experiences that we can bring to the table. I mean, what a perfect solution in emergency management. We can all come together and just talk through and come up with solutions, what's worked, what hasn't worked, and move forward. And I just want to end with this particular slide, which I love because it gives some solid examples of the differences between inequality and equality. So inequality you see in terms of the apples falling off the tree, and maybe many of you have seen this. Equality says, okay, well, you know, the two couldn't get the apples before because they were dropping. Let's give both a ladder and they can both get the apples. But what happens here? One can reach and one can't, right? And then you have equity. Okay, equity says, well, you needed a taller ladder, so I'm going to give you a taller ladder and you can have the ladder where you can reach. Okay, again, and then what happens? Justice. When you're looking at justice, how perfect is that? They've shifted it. They've moved it. The tree is now in an area where individuals can each obtain what they want in terms of the apple. And so, you know, it's just a way of thinking that, you know, when it comes to access, when it comes to inclusion, you know, just want to encourage each of you, and thank you for coming today, to reflect upon, you know, the experiences that you've had, reflect upon equity and access and inclusion and how important it is to you, how important it is to the community, to the work that you do, to the service that you provide, and, you know, make a commitment, coming today and joining me. This has been wonderful. I appreciate it. You know, it's a commitment to change, and, you know, change happens, and, you know, we go step by step, but I think together we'll just continue to make that positive outcome in emergency management that we continue to see. So I believe I have a few minutes left if there's any specific questions, but Emily, maybe I'll turn it back over to you for that. And I'm going to put up my contact information and we can send it out as well. And Peter, who couldn't join us, you know, he definitely sends his best, and maybe I'll bring him next time. He shares a lot from the on the ground as well. But just want to thank you for, you know, coming today and joining me, and hopefully next time I can see everybody in person. Emily?
Thank you so much, Dr. Kate. Is there anyone on the line who has a question? If so, please raise your hand. Okay, seeing none. Is there anyone in the room who has a question? Please approach the microphone right here.
Kate, this is Bob O'Sullivan. I think you can hear me. Can you
hear me? Bob!
That was excellent, Kate. Fantastic, as always. I'm here with Brian Collins, and we're here to endorse your efforts.
Hi, everybody. My FEMA friends.
I'll just relate one example. I was at a office out in California in response to fires, and we actually had a co-worker come in to help us from FEMA, and she came with a service animal, but she was not visually impaired. She needed the animal for emotional support for some other needs, and we had to pay attention not only to her needs, but to the service animal's needs. So some of the things that you think about when you see a service animal is not only the person, but the service animal walking across different services and maybe allergic to certain odors. And there were issues that we had to deal with at the hotel with her accommodation. So when you start thinking about it in that picture of that person trying to get into that cot in that shelter, you know, maybe this cot had to be lowered, or it had to be raised, or maybe they accessed it from the front or the back rather than the side, at the end or the head. But there's so many things that we've never really thought about before that once you start asking, just like you were closing there, just ask, what other accommodations, what other kind of changes do we have to make in order to make you comfortable and make it equitable? So just wanted to see that example and endorse.
Great point. Thanks, Bob. Great point. You're always so wise in your sharing. Yeah, that's a really, really good point. You know, thinking about everyone, including the service animals. So yeah, thanks for sharing.
Anyone else in the room with a question? Okay, well, if everyone will join me in thanking Dr. Kate McCarthy Barnett for her presentation today.
Thanks, everybody. Take care. I appreciate you joining us today.